Well, it's about time for another lecture. Today's topic will be public opinion. Today's lecture is going to address how public opinion impacts the media as well as elections. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to leave this particular topic with an understanding of the 7 different effects or terms and then that address public opinion and the media, and then to evaluate which you think has the biggest impact. Well, if the subject of this lecture is public opinion, we should probably define it. Here's a one-sentence definition from any textbook, probably, of public opinion. Essentially, it's the politically relevant opinions held by average people that they're willing to share or they're willing to express openly. That's a textbook definition of public opinion. So let's begin by exploring public opinion, its impact in elections, and the way in which public opinion is impacted by the media. Public opinion impacts the media with something called the horse race effect. This is where the media tends to focus on a candidate who is ahead or behind in the polls, as opposed to focusing on the candidate's stances on the issues. So just like if you were to go to a horse race, and you would hear, and they're off, and the announcer would focus on who's ahead or who's behind. The media tends to focus on who's ahead or who's behind in the polls, as opposed to candidates' stances on the issues. I'd like to pause for a moment and offer a bit of my bias, which I think others would support. For our democracy to work, people need to vote for candidates based upon their opinion of the candidates, not where they stand in the polls. Maybe a better way to compare candidates is to look at their background in politics. What is their plan for the economy? What kind of proposals do they support to try to improve education or protect the environment? Maybe there's some unique foreign policy experience that a candidate has. Those factors should be taken into consideration as opposed to who's ahead or who's behind in some sort of a poll. But that's my bias. The media is also impacted by something called infotainment. What we've seen in the last 20 years is that the news industry has really made a lot of money. And so a lot of news stories are focused on entertaining viewers with the goal of trying to increase their ratings as opposed to informing viewers as to the background of different candidates. Hey, the graphics look great. Things are interesting and fun and maybe even funny, but style and information wins out over substantive investigative reporting. Often these days, what we see is people go to news shows to be entertained, not necessarily to be informed. So this is an action undertaken by actual viewers. If you're conservative, you tend to be drawn to a station like Fox News because you agree with many of the interpretations, and you end up, wanting to be reinforced by something that you enjoy watching. The same would be true for liberals who might be drawn to a station like MSNBC. And here you see some other examples as well. News is entertaining people, not informing people, in part because consumers want it that way. Again, I just want to reinforce one of my biases here. Really, society and democracy loses by this approach if the news organizations are entertaining us rather than informing us. We need those news stories to inform so that we can have a successful representative democracy. Okay, so we've explored some ways in which the media is impacted by public opinion. Let's explore voter behavior. Voters are often impacted by public opinion with something called the bandwagon effect. This is when voters support a candidate who's ahead in the polls, and they support that person because they're ahead, as opposed to supporting that candidate because of the candidate's stances on the issues. They jump on that candidate's bandwagon. While some voters are impacted by the bandwagon effect, others are impacted by something called the underdog effect. This is when voters support someone who is behind in the polls rather than voting for someone because of the candidate's stances on the issues. I always like to include a visual aid. Well, for the underdog effect, here we see an image of underdog. Still, other voters are impacted by something called the throwaway effect. Let me try to explain. Voters fear they'll be throwing away their vote if they vote for someone who's way behind in the polls, even if they support that candidate's stances on the issues. Sometimes the throwaway effect encourages people just to stay home and they don't vote because they figure, well, my candidate has no chance of winning. Others might vote for one of the front runners because they figure, well, okay, my guy doesn't have a chance of winning, so I'm going to try to influence the election this way. And then we have swing voters. As the name might suggest, swing voters are voters who could maybe vote for any candidate in an election, and in most cases it would be either a Democrat or a Republican. Often these are the so-called difference makers when it comes to winning and losing elections. Ironically, a typical profile of a swing voter is a so-called soccer mom. Ever since the 1990s, the so-called soccer mom vote has been an important profile that has been coveted by both the Democratic and Republican parties because they're often the difference makers in elections. Some of these tendencies is the so-called soccer mom vote. Well, these tend to be white women who live in the suburbs and they come from middle-class families. And they've also had at least some college, and they're engaged in raising families. Some have careers, some stay home and are homemakers. Swing voters are important in any election because you could kind of predict voter behavior in many cases. Often, we know that about 35% of the voters will vote for a Democratic candidate. And about 35% of the voters, again, no matter what, will vote for a Republican candidate. It's the 30% or so in the middle who determine the difference between winning and losing in an election. The chart on the left helps to identify a voter profile of most Americans. Look and see how many are so-called moderates. Those moderates, those people in the middle, often are the difference makers. A while back, Saturday Night Live took a humorous approach to the so-called undecided voters. I will have a link to this on our Canvas site. You can watch that after the lecture if you like. The last topic I'd like to explore when it comes to the role in elections would be the impact of public opinion and exit polls. Exit polls are polls that are conducted the day of an election as people leave election sites and they're asked, hey, who did you vote for and what were some of the key reasons why you voted for this candidate or this particular topic? It's a way to try to predict the outcome of an election before the results are official. And it also was kind of like, do I dare say, an autopsy, helping to explain why people voted for certain candidates. So now I'd like to explore some of the exit poll results from the 2024 presidential election. On the left, you see different categories of people based upon race. That's what this one is focusing on. And then we also see the percentage of people who voted for Kamala Harris, for Donald Trump, and then over on the left, or excuse me, on the right, you see the percentage of the total number of people who voted. So we'll look at this in more detail on the next slide. Now we'll highlight some of the results from that same slide. So on the right, you see the white circle around the number 71. So 71% of the people who voted in 2024 were white. Donald Trump did well among white voters. 55% of white people voted for Donald Trump. And, you know, they made up 71% of the population, so he did really well there. On the left, under Kamala Harris, she did well among African American voters, Hispanic voters, and Asian voters. So that's why that's circled in blue. Here we see some of the breakdown based upon sex. 53% of the people who voted in 2024 were female. Just think about that because it wasn't until 1920 that women had the right to vote nationally.
Well, among women, um, Harris won those votes, generally speaking, with 54% of the vote, whereas Donald Trump did well among male voters. So this slide lets us dig down a little bit as we look at and explore race and sex. So the big area here that you see, the big red circle, you see white women. White women made up of 37% of the voters in the 2024 election. 52% of white women voted for Donald Trump. If you scroll down just a little bit, you see 54% of Latino men voted for Donald Trump. That was actually a surprise because Latino or Latina voters usually vote kind of as a group, but there was a gap between Latino men and Latino women. Because if you look just a little bit to the left in the circled area in blue, Latino women voted pretty strongly for Harris, whereas, again, the men tended to vote for Trump. Harris did well among black men, black women, and Latina women. Education also was a factor that influenced people's vote in 2024. 62% of the people who had not attended college voted for Donald Trump. You see, some college, he had 50%, and then if someone had an associate's degree, it was 55%. Harris did well among people who already had a bachelor's degree or a postgraduate degree. I promise this is the last slide dealing with national exit poll results. Population or where a person lives can actually be a predictor for voter behavior. Notice the red area here that's circled. Donald Trump did really well for people living in rural areas or small cities. He also had a slight advantage over Harris in the suburbs. Generally speaking, people living in large cities tend to vote Democratic more often, and so you see that figure here where Harris won 60% of the vote for people living in cities. Well, in the fall of 2024, several students conducted exit poll results at two locations, one in Mason County and one in Manistee County. It was really a good experiment, and people were willing to fill out the surveys and things like that, and students worked all day long in 2-hour shifts. Overall, it went well, but I do have to admit, when it started to rain, it was really rough for students. But it was really cool and a neat opportunity for them. And several people really enjoyed what they did. It was just the weather that was a bit rough. While these are not official results because the exit polling was only done at two locations, we see that Donald Trump fared better in Mason and Manistee County than Harris did, whereas Trump won 56% of the vote for people in Ludington and Manistee at these two polling sites. Again, this isn't scientific, but it's a reflection of the community where most of us live. I'd like to wrap things up and identify some of the key ideas and concepts included in the lecture next.
Well, over the course of this lecture, we've defined public opinion and offered some examples as to how the media, voter behavior, and exit polls impact our political process. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to define those 7 terms that are listed on the lecture outline and evaluate which you believe has the biggest impact on elections. Well, that's all for today. Hopefully you learned something new about public opinion.